Welcome to the fourth video in this Studio Ghibli series. In this video, we'll be analyzing the main theme from the very first movie that Hayao Miyazaki and Joe Hisaishi ever collaborated on, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This particular arrangement did not appear in the original movie, but was later adapted by Joe Hisaishi from the much longer symphonic poem that was originally written for the film. In fact, this piece was arranged as a standalone piece for piano, and as such, this video will not contain an orchestration analysis like the last three videos have. Other than that, this video will proceed like all the others and will consist of three parts. In part 1, we'll start by discussing what emotions this piece helps to evoke. In part 2, we'll quickly break down some of the music theory found in the rhythm, melody, and harmony of this piece. Finally, in part 3, we'll wrap up the video by discussing which particular strategies and tools were the most impactful for creating the emotional feel of the music. For your convenience, I've included timestamps in the description of this video to each of these sections. Just as a quick disclaimer, this series will by necessity require a decent amount of music theory. I'll do my best to explain things as I go, but in order to stay on track, I won't be able to stop to explain everything that comes up. So if music theory isn't a strength of yours, I recommend taking some notes and keeping a running list of any terms you don't recognize, so that you can look them up later and hopefully expand your skill set. Regardless, I'll try my best to be as clear as possible, especially in the third part of this video, where we'll be diving into the really useful stuff. So with that, let's get started. As usual, the first thing I want to do in this analysis is to identify what emotions the music helps me to feel. By now, you should know that this is an important step because it helps to differentiate a film score analysis from a purely theoretical analysis. My goal isn't to document every single musical gesture and tool found in this music. Instead, I'm trying to find out what emotional response this music evokes in me, and more importantly, why. When I'm done, I want to know what specific lessons or strategies I can use to evoke similar emotions in my own music. So before I can go any further, I need to name the emotions that I feel while listening to this piece. Right away, I've got to name those trademark feelings of nostalgia and longing that it seems like all of Hisaishi's music seems to capture so brilliantly. However, this piece also seems to carry a unique, vitalizing sensation to it that the previous three didn't have. For whatever reason, when I listen to this music, I feel like I'm being spurred to action, to do something. The piece is one of the most ambient that we've discussed, but it still carries a great deal of momentum in a way that feels different from the others. This makes sense since the movie follows the titular character as she tries to stop a war between two powerful nations. There are high stakes and a sense of desperation throughout the story, so the music would need to reflect that. So now that I've identified the emotional response that I have to this music, it's time to figure out why. Once again, let's set the stage by looking at the rhythm and tempo, where we'll actually find something different this time around. We do stick to our usual 4/4 time, but the tempo isn't nearly as steady as we're used to. Instead, the intro just starts straight up as tempo rubato. Traditionally, this can be interpreted to be somewhere around 75 beats per minute. But honestly, it encourages the performer to play whatever tempo they feel is most natural. This is only further emphasized by the use of fermatas at the end of every single measure, which allows the performer to hold out the notes as long as they want to. So, in essence, we're starting this entire piece off with an intro that doesn't necessarily have a steady beat. The performer is just setting a vibe for the rest of the piece. We don't get our first specific tempo until section A, where we are finally told 75 beats per minute, which is much closer to what we're used to, a nice moderate tempo. But then, later in section D, we are told to increase the tempo to 90 beats per minute, which is the fastest tempo we've come across in all 4 pieces we've studied. It stays there for a full section before returning back to 75 beats per minute in section E, where it remains for most of the piece, barring a few ritardandi here and there. So, right off the bat, we're setting the stage for a more rhythmically expressive piece of music. Where the tempo has previously remained more constant, we're now seeing it used much more flexibly to help tell the story. In fact, this is the only piece we'll cover in which Hisaishi routinely uses non-musical language to describe just what kind of vibe he's going for. For example, in section A, he writes, "As we hear in the background of darkness." In section E, he describes it as flying up to the sky. Or, my personal favorite, he describes section F as like snow falling heavily by the sea. He uses many of these descriptors to help make sure that the music captures exactly what he's looking for. In other words, he's expecting the performer to take certain liberties with how they interpret the music, and doesn't want them to follow the tempo or rhythm too strictly. So that alone is enough to set this piece off as a little more unique than the others. But there's still one more defining difference. In each of the previous pieces, we found that the 8th note was the shortest frequently used note in the melody. And while this remains true for the harmony of this piece, the melody is actually written much more slowly, by using a quarter note as the shortest frequently used note. There are only 3 sections where we find the 8th note used much more liberally, which helps to emphasize a bit of contrast and build up the energy of the music. But the remaining 8 sections stick mostly to notes of at least an entire beat in length. This dramatically reduces the amount of energy that the melody brings to play, and once again sets the tone for a more emotional and ambient experience. Other than these few major differences, we can still find a few similarities with the other pieces. Namely, the use of dotted rhythms and triplets are still common throughout the piece. As we've seen before, they help to contribute a syncopated personality to the theme, which actually transitions us nicely into our discussion of the melody. Here, we don't see anything too new. It all seems to coincide with what we've come to expect from the previous 3 pieces, which is good, because it means that this piece isn't so different that it could end up throwing off the template we're trying to build. First, the melody sticks mostly to conjunct movement, with the majority of disjunct movement coming from thirds, perfect fourths, and perfect fifths. Many of these larger leaps are used specifically as tools for developing the motivic material after it has first been established. The grand majority of the notes used are chordal tones, with the most common non-chordal tones being passing tones and neighbor tones. Keeping in mind Hisaishi's propensity to use color chords, we find that color tones are once again used quite frequently in the melody, with sevenths, ninths, and suspended fourths all being common. Looking at the phrase structure, we find that he uses mostly 4-bar phrases with the pickups, each phrase seeming to focus on a large amount of motivic material. Various countermelodies are used throughout the piece, mostly as a strategy for growth and building energy. This is actually incredibly important, since the movement in the countermelody helps give the music a sense of energy that would otherwise be lacking due to the frequent lack of 8th notes in the primary melody and an incredibly slow harmonic rhythm. This brings us to the final topic of this quick analysis: harmony. For the most part, the harmony of this piece is set up similarly to the other pieces we have analyzed so far. The majority of the piece remains in a minor key, with a short modulation to a closely related key later in the piece. This time, the modulation takes us to F minor, before returning to the original key of C minor. This modulation uses secondary dominance, just like with the previous three pieces that we've seen. Then, the whole piece ends on one final modulation when it switches to C major for the very last chord. Looking at the chords, we find the vast majority to be color chords, with ninths and sevenths and suspended chords all being common. In the same thread, the chords are often written in closed voicing when used for rhythmic or melodic purposes, and in open voicings when used for harmonic purposes like arpeggios or suspended chords. All of these traits and strategies keep within the parameters of what we have come to expect from the previous three videos. However, there are still a few unique tools worthy of note. First, the harmonic rhythm is just ridiculously slow compared to what we're used to. Instead of the moderate pace of one chord per measure that we're used to, this piece often holds a single chord from anywhere between 4 to 8 measures before switching to a new chord. This completely removes the harmony from any kind of role involved with building energy or momentum for the piece, with the exception of a few spots where the harmonic rhythm does increase up to 1 chord per measure. Instead, the harmony becomes almost completely ambient and emotional in nature. However, to keep the overall energy of the piece on the higher side, Hisaishi implements a few strategies to keep things moving. Like the previous pieces, he uses rhythmic figures like arpeggios and vamps to help the harmony feel like it's still moving. He also relies on the strategy we've seen in the previous pieces, where he introduces and removes color tones to fake a faster harmonic rhythm. Finally, he implements a new strategy in which he manipulates the voicings, inversions, and registers of the harmony to once again fake a harmonic rhythm. In these instances, the chord remains the same, but the inversion type and shift in the register of specific chordal tones help it to sound as if there's still forward momentum in the harmony. One last thing worth noting in this analysis is that we see a return of one of my favorite strategies used in One Summer's Day. In this instance, the chords played rhythmically suggest a separate chord than the bass line does. For example, in the first measure of section C, we see an E flat major 7 performed rhythmically in the left hand, while a low C sustained in the bass line instead transforms the chord into a C minor 9. As the C is only sustained and not repeated, it creates a sense of almost transforming the chord, as each time the E flat major 7 is repeated, it takes more control over its own identity, while the C slowly fades out. Personally, I think this is really cool, and just can't stop geeking out about it whenever I see it used in his music. But now that we've finished a very brief analysis of the rhythm, melody, and harmony, let's move on to part 3 of this video and discuss which strategies were the most important for creating the emotional palette of this piece. Starting with the rhythm and tempo, we have the use of 4/4 time and dotted rhythms that we've seen across all the pieces so far. These help give the music an integral part of the Ghibli identity. However, the use of more frequent tempo changes, heavier use of rubato, and especially the descriptive directions that are written throughout the entire piece are integral to creating the ambient feeling that was so prevalent throughout this piece. They give the performer both a clear idea of what Hisaishi is trying to achieve with the music, and the freedom to perform it in a way they believe best captures that image. In the melody, we mostly found strategies that we are, by now, quite familiar with. The use of mostly conjunct movement, chordal tones, four-bar phrases, and motivic material all help to keep the melody lyrical and memorable, while the heavy use of color tones throughout helped to increase the feelings of nostalgia and longing through the use of light dissonance. The only new strategy of note was how the countermelody played a much stronger role in keeping the forward momentum alive, by remaining rhythmically active in the face of the slow and sustained primary melody. Finally, the harmony used many strategies, both familiar and new to us. First, the minor keys kept us closer to the melancholic side of the emotional spectrum, while a large number of color chords throughout helped to blur the emotional connotations that the listener has with the music, keeping things feeling quite nostalgic. It wasn't until we looked at the harmonic rhythm that we started seeing new strategies unfurl. The ridiculously slow harmonic rhythm took much of the energy out of our chord progression, while simultaneously putting a heavier emphasis on the ambient nature of the chords. To keep things from slowing down too much, Hisaishi kept the vitalizing and energetic feel of the music by manipulating rhythmic patterns, voicings, inversions, registers, and color tones to frequently fake a somewhat faster harmonic rhythm. Finally, he used a variation of the morphing chord strategy that we first found in One Summer's Day to contribute to both the energy and ambience of the piece in general. So with that, we've reached the end of the fourth video in this series. I hope that you're finding it helpful and that you're starting to catch on to the patterns that help to give this music its signature sound. We only have one last piece to analyze before we finally take a look at the template for this style. If you'd like to be notified when the next video is released, please like and subscribe to my channel and share it with anyone you think might find it useful. I want to thank you all again for your tremendous support. I never expected to see the channel grow this quickly over the course of this series, and your wonderful comments and emails keep me excited to keep creating new content. A special thanks goes out to my patrons, whose support is helping to make future composer series like this one possible. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, or if you just can't wait for the next upload, the remaining 2 videos of this series have already been uploaded to my Patreon page, along with the finished template, scripts to all of my videos, and the 50+ pages worth of detailed notes that I took while studying the music for this series. The link can be found in the description of this video. So, thank you again for your incredible support. And until next time, keep studying, keep working hard, and as always, keep writing new music.